Podcast with Sheila, the podcast that is spreading positivity around the world by sharing inspiring life experiences. With me today is a veteran couples therapist and author, Dr. Bruce Chalmer. I hope I got the name right.
You did. You got it just right. Thank you.
Great. We will be discussing one of the deepest wounds in relationships, betrayal. As usual, we aim to educate, motivate, and inspire you. So grab your warm drinks and let's get it rolling. Hello, Dr. Chalmer, and welcome to Podcast with Sheila.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Would you like to introduce yourself to our guests for those watching you for the first time?
Yeah, sure. I'm a psychologist and couples therapist. I've been doing that in private practice now for just over 30 years. And I've been working, I did a lot of individual therapy as well, but over the last 10 or 15 years, I've been focusing more and more on couples work because I find it really inspiring. I've learned a lot from the people that I've worked with, and the books I've written really are reflecting the things I've learned from being privileged to be admitted into those struggles that couples are having and to trying to help them with it. And I've learned a lot from that, and I really appreciate that.
Wow, I'm excited we are doing this episode today, and I believe that, I know that a lot of couples are going through a lot of challenges, particularly with the kind of economy, the crisis, and everything else is having an impact on relationships, and people are going through a lot. So I'm happy we are doing this episode today. I believe that anybody who has the opportunity to chance on this live during the recording or even after will benefit a lot from it. So thank you very much for your time. But let's go straight into it. Your book, Betrayal and Forgiveness, speaks directly to the pain many couples are experiencing. What inspired you to write this particular book at this stage in your career?
Well, I noticed over the course of that time I've been doing this that I think I never really counted exactly, but I think it's over half of the couples that I work with are dealing with something that they would probably call a betrayal. Lots and lots of just regular old infidelity. I see a lot of that. And other kinds of betrayals as well. So many of the couples that have come to me in the first session, that's what they're talking about. And I realized that when they can heal from that, and by heal, it doesn't always mean they stay together, but they can heal in the sense that they can get past the obsession with it. They can get past the anger and the pain, and then they can actually come to decide, well, maybe they can trust each other, maybe they can't. But that's so much of the work that I do that I thought, well, as I mentioned before, I learned a lot from the folks I've worked with. So that's why it led me to write the book about that.
Wow, thank you very much for sharing that. If you're just joining us and you're saying hi to you, thank you very much. But let me ask you, doctor, what will cause people not to keep their promise to their partner? Why is there so much infidelity in marriages, in relationships today? What will be causing that?
Yeah, there's not just one cause, but there's a number of different things. But some of the big ones that I tend to see, usually, at least the people who come to me for therapy, usually the when they come and they're talking about infidelity, the person who did the cheating will often say something like, "I never would have thought in a million years I'd be doing that." So it's not like, usually the folks who come to me are not saying, oh, they just, they did it because they could get away with it. That's not what it is at all. It was a process of things not going well, and then they became vulnerable to it. And that's usually how it happens. And sometimes that's because, for whatever reason, the couple itself starts to lose intimacy. And by intimacy, I don't just mean sexual relations, I mean more generally. Often what happens is people will sacrifice being open and honest with each other because it feels too scary. It feels too dangerous, especially if they want to bring up something that might be, surprising to their partner, or they worry about how their partner is going to receive it. So they will often sacrifice intimacy for the sake of stability, for the sake of, kind of keeping things going and not rocking the boat too much. And that will make people vulnerable to someone else's attention. Again, I'm not excusing it in a moral sense, but the folks who come to see me generally aren't excusing it in a moral sense either. They're saying, yeah, I know it was wrong, but the couples that can heal from that, either again together or separate, are the ones who will say, well, yeah, we know it was wrong, but it was meaningful, it was important. You know, we're all valid people in this, even when we mess up. And so that's the sense in which, what leads people to infidelity is often that they become vulnerable to it. Now there are other reasons too occasionally, but most of the folks I work with, that's what the situation is.
Wow. Betrayal often leaves a trail of emotional distraction. In your experience, what are the first steps someone should take after discovering betrayal in their relationship?
Yeah, well, usually they're in some kind of shock. Because what makes something a betrayal, anyone on earth can hurt someone else, but betrayal is happening when someone hurts you in a way you never would have thought they would have because
Yes.
of your relationship with them. So if somebody has betrayed you, it's usually people are usually in some kind of shock. Often what they are is they're questioning their own sanity or questioning their own judgment. They have a hard time not only trusting the person who betrayed them, but also even trusting themselves. So the initial phases are about essentially getting hold of yourself, trying to make it so that you're not completely panicking every time you think about it. And that takes some time usually. It takes, that's not something that usually people get past in a conversation or two. It takes some time to just get to the point where they can think clearly enough that maybe they can think about, all right, how do they proceed? So the initial phases of that, it's if you have people you can lean on for some support, that's very helpful. Therapists can be helpful in that, just in terms of helping someone, as I say, find themselves again so that they're not in a total panic. And at that point, when they can get to that place of not being in a complete panic, that's when it becomes possible to start thinking about, okay, what do you want to do about this? Is it possible to forgive someone? And I use the word forgiveness in a particular way. There's lots, people use the word forgiveness in different ways. Sometimes people think when you use the word forgive, they'll say, well, if I forgive someone who hurt me, that means I'll restore our relationship to what it was and I can trust them again. And the way I use the word forgive, and I'm not the only one, I don't mean that at all. You can forgive someone you don't trust at all. You can forgive someone you have every intention of divorcing. You can forgive somebody that you would prosecute in court. It's not about the relationship with the other person. It's about your own heart. It's about letting go of the obsession, letting go of the anger, so that then you can think clearly. And lots of folks like to quote the novelist Anne Lamott, who has a wonderful quote about forgiveness. She says, "To not forgive is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die."
There are lots of questions I would love to ask you, but I don't know how to process them in my mind because they weren't part of the questions I said. But hopefully, I'll be able to put them together as we carry on. But my next question is: you've coined the phrase "be kind, don't panic, and have faith." Can you explain how these 7 words can guide couples through even their most difficult moments?
Yes, yeah, it's a sort of formula I came up with many years ago. Somebody just asked me, "How do you do couples therapy?" And I said, "Well, basically, that's what we're telling people: be kind, don't panic, and have faith." So, what do I mean by that? It's three principles. Be kind, don't panic, have faith. Be kind. I don't just mean be nice. I mean be kin. Recognize your kinship with someone, because that's what keeps couples together when they still experience each other as kin, even though they have differences, even though they have things that annoy each other or whatever. When they still feel that sense that, well, we're in this together, we're kin. That's what keeps them together. You can't do that if you're in a panic. So the don't panic part is really so that you can then be kind in the sense of kinship. So don't panic, and therefore you can be kind. Well, it used to be just 5 words: be kind and don't panic. And then I started telling people that, and they said, well, that's interesting, but how do you not panic? And that's where I realized, I don't have a simple formula for how to not panic. But what I noticed was the couples that did well were the ones who had what I call faith. And when I say faith, I don't mean necessarily religious faith, although of course, it's not inconsistent with religious faith. But I mean that basic mindset that says, this whole existence thing is right to be what it is, even when it's painful. There's some rightness about it. And religious folks could translate it into God is good. Whatever God means, God is good. There's something, even though there's all this pain and suffering and people betray people and things like that, there's some rightness about the whole business. And the folks who had that mindset were the ones who could then look at a betrayal, for example, and not panic about it or get past the panic. And then they could actually find meaning in it. and then they could figure out how they could still be kin with each other or how to decide not to be kin with each other. So those three principles: be kind, don't panic, and have faith. It's have faith, which is the antidote to panic. And then if you're not panicking, then you can be kind. And that's, when couples experience each other as they just know each other to have goodwill, that's what will get them past a lot of differences, a lot of difficulties.
Well, I like the last bit you threw in there, that when couples know each other to have goodwill, there should be something that keeps the relationship stronger. That even when the boat rocks, when you think about some of those moments, it makes you want to say, I'll give it a try.
Yes.
No matter what is happening, let's give it another chance. But then, how do you deal with a partner who keeps going back to doing the same thing over and over again? And every time, what they keep saying is, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. For me, I'd be asking, when are we ever going to learn from this mistake and go past it? Because if at the time where both of us were 25 years old, we were making this mistake, at 30 years, you're making this mistake, at 40 years, you're making this mistake, when are we going to go past this?
Yeah.
How are we going to make this work? And especially when there are children in the family and you don't want to break up, how
Hmm.
do you work around some of these things? And also know that even though the boat has been rocked a number of times, when each other say, we are sorry, let's do it again. And is it genuine? How do you even know this time around it's not going to happen again? How do you put your whole self out there? How do you trust again? Look, the
Yeah.
questions are a lot. I don't know how to put them together, but yeah.
They're all really important questions. And as I think is probably true with most really important questions, I don't know of any easy answers to them because you can't tell for sure. I mentioned earlier that people come in and there's been infidelity, and the one who did the cheating is saying, "I never would have thought in a million years." Well, the other person often says, "I never would have thought in a million years that if my husband or wife, whatever, cheated on me, that I would be willing to continue."
Yeah.
And yet there they are, often willing to continue. It's just not easy to say. If it keeps happening and happening and happening, I mean, most people eventually realize, wow, even if I trust this person's intentions, I just can't trust that they're going to follow through. But, on the other hand, people mature. People do learn from experience. I mean, sometimes somebody does cheat, two or three times and then learns how to be faithful, or something changes in their life, something changes in their understanding. People do transform sometimes, and it isn't perfectly predictable. So I don't have a simple formula for knowing, exactly, well, how do you know whether to trust somebody when it's the second or third or fourth time they've done something, that you wish they didn't do. It just isn't that easy. I do know, I have another probably fairly silly thing I like to point out, which is, yeah, at one time, my wife Judy Alexander, and I do a podcast, and called Couples Therapy in 7 Words, by the way, based on those 7 words. And one time we were waiting for a guest, and the guest had an emergency and didn't show, and here we were wanting to record a podcast. So I said, "Oh, I know. Let's do a podcast about the one relationship skill that solves all relationship problems. Not too grandiose, right? Just a little." So, and she said, "Oh, yeah, right." And I said, "Yeah, sure, let's do that." So she said, "All right, what is it?" And I said, "Well, it is the ability to be mildly annoyed as opposed to freaking out totally. Because if you can be mildly annoyed with your partner, first of all, there are no partners in this world, there are no two human beings who don't occasionally annoy each other.
Yeah.
And when a couple is going well, when they have gratitude and love and respect, and when that's the dominant story, then those annoyances are just funny or a little annoying, but no big deal. And the problem happens when that dominant narrative isn't about how they are grateful for each other and love each other and respect each other. When the dominant narrative is, "Oh, you don't seem to care about me, or you're out to get me, or whatever." And then all of those annoyances become serious. Everyone becomes, "Oh, there's more evidence for why this person is not the right person, or why they don't really like me, or whatever." So that ability to be mildly annoyed, that has to coexist with also feeling like, yeah, but we know we love each other, because it's inevitable. There will be annoyances. And then, as I say, when things go well, you just sort of smile and enjoy them because after when you're with somebody for a long time, you get to know their quirks and you realize, oh yeah, well that's just who they are, and that I love them for being that, as opposed to freaking out about
Wow. Many people confuse forgiveness with forgetting and excusing. How do you define true forgiveness, especially after deep emotional wounds?
it. Yeah, well, I was mentioning that earlier. Forgiveness. This is not a phrase I coined, but I like it. Forgiveness is an inside job. In other words, it's not about the other person. So you can forgive someone and not at all trust them. And the notion of forgiving and forgetting, I think, is kind of nonsense. If you literally forgot about it, there's nothing to forgive. And I've heard that come up. It hasn't happened to me, but I've heard it from several people who've gone to like a high school reunion, 30 years later, and somebody will come up to them and apologize profusely for something they did in high school, and they have no memory of it. There's no need for forgiveness there. They didn't even think about it.
Mm.
It just wasn't there. So forgiveness is necessary when you do remember it and you don't forget about it. And that's another challenge for a couple that's healing from some kind of betrayal, because they won't forget about it. And what it looks like when it goes well, or what it feels like after they process things and things are healed, they don't forget about it. What they look at it as is an opportunity for growth. And I have had numbers of people say things. And one story I love to tell, I think I mentioned it in one of my books, is a couple I worked with for about a year and a half, I think it was. And this is before the pandemic. Since the pandemic, I've been doing all telehealth, but this was when they were seeing me in person. And this was their last session because they were moving, they were leaving town. And they had done amazing work. When they had come to me, it was just after the wife had discovered the husband's infidelity. She was just in terrible, terrible shape and had lost a huge amount of weight from just not being able to eat. And he was a wreck and realized he had to face the fact he had an alcohol problem. Anyway, they did amazing, courageous work. And in that last session, they were both talking about how much better off they were than they ever had been. And she turned to him and said, "Hey, thanks for taking one for the team." And he said, "Oh, what do you mean by that?" And I said, "Hey, what do you mean by that?" And she said, "Well, you're the one who did the thing you had to feel guilty about, because he was the one who did the cheating."
Yeah.
She didn't have to feel guilty. She didn't cheat, but she realized that the crisis that then happened, that they worked through, was so necessary for them. She didn't say, "Thanks for cheating." I've never heard anybody say that. She didn't say, "Well, thanks for cheating on me. That was great." No, she didn't say that. But she did say, basically, "Thanks for precipitating the crisis, because we needed it apparently. And look how much better off we are now." And she was talking about not only how much better her relationship was with her husband, but how much better her relationship was with their kids and with her coworkers and with her friends, because she was so much less panicked by much of life for having gone through that crisis and worked through it. It really is something that, when I talk about having faith, it really helps a person's faith to get through a crisis. And I saw your explanation as to where this podcast came from,
Yeah.
and I'm curious to ask you about that. Actually, that phenomenon of surviving sepsis.
Yeah.
Wow, does that give you perspective or what? I'm curious. And it sounds like you have a great deal of gratitude around that.
I do, because I was in between life and death. And at that time, all I could say was, I remember that was one prayer I prayed. I said, "God, I have so much to offer the world, and I don't think it's time for me to leave yet. Give me another more chance. And then I'll tell my story and let people know that whatever they are going through, it doesn't mean it's the end of it yet." And it was a lot of hope for me. And it was a lot of growing up through that journey. Well, my life has been a lot of growing up. And I always tell people that I'm not that old. I'm just in my nearly mid 40s, but my life experience is like somebody who's lived like 70, 80 years. I've experienced everything,
Wow.
everything, and I'm always still experiencing more. And I don't know how I get through them. Sometimes I look back and I'm like, did I go through that? And am I still here? Did I go through that? I've experienced my child dying. I've experienced sepsis. I've experienced strange things. I've experienced marital struggles. I've experienced everything. And I'm still here. But every day I find a reason to live. But recently, I think what is actually driving me more are my children. I have two children, and those children, I see maturity in them, and they've been my strength. And every time my son will come, "Mommy, are you okay? Are you?" if it wasn't just this podcast we're recording, he'll be here giving me a hug now, saying, "Are you okay?" Checking in on me and all of that. And I draw strength from them. But I've seen that I have evolved as a person from where I was coming from, because I was brought up in a very shielded life. My
Mm,
mother especially will hardly allow us to do things on our own. She was always like doing it for us, doing it for us. And when I stepped into life, well, into the world, I'll say, I stepped into it as a complete novice. So I made a lot of mistakes. I trusted too much. I didn't know how to draw boundaries and say, or I didn't know how to draw boundaries for people. I was too plain and thought that if I'd not come to you with any issue, you shouldn't be coming to me with one. Only
mm,
to learn that you don't have to go to people with problems. They bring it to you anyway, whether you're asking for it or not. So there's so many things that I learned that I've gone out of it. But the podcast actually came from a place where I knew that you could be here today, tomorrow you are no more.
yeah.
And appreciating life as it goes and being grateful for the most little thing that you have. And know that um, life is a privilege and is not a right.
And it's the painful stuff that we all go through in varying ways that we learn the most from. And don't get me wrong, I wish everybody pleasure and joy,
Yeah.
but real lives also include pain and sorrow and fear and all of that stuff. And that's what we learn perspective from. And that's what you were just talking about. That perspective you have where you can now appreciate life in ways that maybe you couldn't before you went through all those things. And that's what a couple can do when they heal from a betrayal. It's like, yeah, betrayals are awful. I mean, by definition, they're awful. But when you can heal from them, people will often express gratitude. And then that's true of the couples that stay together as well as the couples that split up. They will often say, well, that was painful. Sorry we split up, or I'm so glad we're together. But wow, did we learn from that? I'm so much more developed a person. I'm no longer a novice at life. Well, everybody starts off as a novice at life, and then you get bumped around and you learn from it.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. In your podcast and writing, you discuss the tension between stability and intimacy. Why do these two important elements sometimes seem to conflict?
Yeah. Well, they're both important. I call them needs, and a need is, I'm not using that term lightly. It's not just a desire, it's a need. Something isn't working right if they're not fulfilled enough. Stability is important because it feels really scary when things are unstable. That's kind of what that means. And so people will prize stability as much as they can. And that makes sense. There's nothing wrong with that. The trouble is intimacy requires that you tolerate anxiety rather than avoid it. It required because intimacy is sometimes scary. And again, I'm not just talking about when it's pleasant. If people are having lovely relationship with each other, be it sexual or otherwise, if it feels good, that's not about anxiety. But I'm talking about something where maybe you want to say to your partner something as simple as just a complaint. Hey, I wish you do X, Y, or Z you're not doing, or I wish you wouldn't do X, Y, or Z that you are doing, or something. That's going to raise anxiety. You have to be willing to do that, and if you don't, you're going to hold it in. It's going to build up, and then you're going to blow up at pretty much anything. And it's not just about things like complaints. It's about things like, oh, dreams and fantasies and things that you're wishing for that you might be afraid to tell your partner because you might think, oh no, what are you going to think of me if I say this is what I want to try? So a lot of times couples that are good at stability tend to avoid unintentionally, but they tend to avoid intimacy. And the problem is lack of intimacy becomes destabilizing because that's what leads to things like affairs. My favorite metaphor about stability and intimacy is if you think of a plant, a seed gets planted in soil and it sprouts and starts to grow. Somebody comes along and paves a sidewalk over it. Now, why would they pave a sidewalk over it? Well, for stability, right? It's easier to walk on. Well, that's fine, but what that plant is going to try to do is crack the sidewalk. And we've
Yeah.
all seen,
Yeah.
cracked
Yeah.
sidewalks with plants going through because the roots provide stability, but intimacy is the energy for growth. And that's true for a couple as much as it's true for a plant, it's true for individuals. Intimacy is the energy for growth. And if that gets somehow cut off or compromised, then somebody's going to try to crack the sidewalk. And betrayals are often about cracking the sidewalk. Maybe that's not all they're about, but that's often what they're about. And so what does it look like? Either somebody betrays someone, or maybe one or both people get very depressed because it feels kind of deadening to not feel that sense of feeling alive with someone. Or somebody up and leaves unexpectedly, somebody gets blindsided that way. It's like, whoa, you're out of here. All of a sudden, I didn't even know there was anything wrong. Those are all the kind of symptoms of lack of intimacy. So a lot of the work is about tolerating the anxiety that can let you then be honest with yourself and each other, which is what I mean by intimacy.
What are some of, well, I think you've just talked about intimacy, but let's give proper examples of moments of intimacy for couples. If people are wondering, what are some of the things we should be talking about or we should be doing to bring us together?
Mhm.
Basic things that we can do that wouldn't break up, whatever, just like a few suggestions that would
Yeah.
help us ride on. Yeah.
Well, I'll give you a very general rule. It's kind of a funny way to say it, but a general rule for what things you need to talk about are the things you're afraid to talk about. Whatever you're afraid to talk about, those are probably the things you need to talk about because that's what intimacy is about. There's good reason often people are afraid to bring things up. Like what are the things that often get couples into trouble? The big topics. There's kids, there's money, and there's sex. You
Yeah.
know, those and things related to those things. And people have good reason for being afraid to talk about some of these things if they have, serious differences about how they think they ought to be raising their kids, or serious differences about how they think they ought to be managing their money, or serious differences about how they want to have sex with each other. All of those things can be scary. And so if they don't talk about those things, that's when trouble happens. So it's the stuff, if you want to know, well, gee, what would lead to intimacy? It's feels a little counterintuitive. It's like, well, intimacy is supposed to feel good, and you're telling me I should do the things that make me scared. And I'm saying, well, yeah, those are the scary things. The things that make you feel good, you're already doing. That's easy. Keep doing that. But it's the things that you're afraid to talk about. And very often, and it's not just those three topics, but those are the big three. Very often couples are really afraid to talk about those things for good reason, because when they've tried, perhaps things have gone off the rails. So that's when having a couples therapist could be helpful. They can have somebody who can sit with them and be the one person in the conversation who's not freaking out, so that that person can be curious for both of them and help them be curious rather than just yelling at each other. They can actually hear each other. And again, those conversations do raise anxiety because hearing your partner's point of view might be like, oh my, in the extreme case, it could be, oh wow, I'm not sure. That might be a deal breaker. We're two good people, but maybe not for each other. And that's a painful thing when people bump into that. Or it may just be something like, wow, I'd never thought of it that way. And there's a lot of hope in that. When you get to something, it's like, oh, I'm hearing my partner say something and I'm realizing I never thought of it that way. That's when you're in a place like that, there's the hope. It's like, oh yeah, now you're thinking differently. You're not stuck in the assumptions you've been making, and you're actually hearing each other. And a lot of the work of couples therapy is getting people to those moments. I have a slightly vulgar way, which I won't say. I'm not sure what your language code is. I will call it the oh shoot moment. The oh shoot moment for a couple is when they recognize, oh, now I see what's going on here. You're not crazy and I'm not crazy, but we really do have a difference, don't we? See, I call it that rather than the aha moment. The aha moment is like, oh, we've got a solution. Great, we're both happy. This is not the aha moment. This is before that. This is like, oh, no wonder we're having this problem. I'm not crazy, but neither are you. Ooh, now what do we do? That's the oh shoot moment. And when you get there, that's when couples are able to start hearing each other. They may not have a solution right away, but at least they're not in a panic and they're not squabbling at that point. They're feeling the pain, but at least they're listening. So if the therapist can help a couple get to that, I dramatize it by calling it a moment. It's really more of a process. But if you can get to that, that's when things can change. That's when one or both parties can recognize, oh wow, we're not as stuck as we thought we were. Let's see what we can do here.
Wow. Let's talk about faith. Not necessarily the religious sense of faith, but how does faith as a mindset help couples rebuild trust and connection?
Yeah. Well, that's, again, I call that kind of the key. It is a mindset, as you mentioned. And what do I mean by mindset? It's a way of understanding the world. Faith, as I define the term, faith is when you accept that reality is right to be what it is. That's what I mean by faith. It's right, even when it's painful, even if I can't understand why it's right, there's going to be a lot of that. I don't have a God's eye view of the universe. I haven't got all the data, but it's a mindset that says, yeah, but it's got to be basically right. And the reason I say it's a mindset, that's not a statement that can be proven or disproven. You can look around the world and say, well, obviously the world is a total mess and it's terrible. And you can find all kinds of things to point to and say, look at how terrible all that is. And you can also look at the world and say, well, the world is basically wonderful. And look at all those examples of love and joy and generosity and all those great things. Neither of those statements are right or wrong. They're both accurate. So there's no question of faith. The idea of faith, as I'm describing it, isn't about something you can prove to be right or wrong. It's a mindset. What you can show, not just in experience, and also there's even research on this stuff. What you can show is that if people have that mindset, things tend to go better for them. I'm not trying, I'm not being mystical about it. I'm not saying, oh, the universe treats you better. I'm just saying, no, you have more resources available to figure out what you can do if you enter it with a mindset of faith. And I mentioned this earlier, the couples that have that mindset of faith, even when they're dealing with something really painful like infidelity, are the ones who are able to say, let me tell you what they don't do. The couples that don't have the mindset of faith come in and say, the one who did the cheating is saying, oh, it's terrible, I'll never do it again, I feel so bad, and let's just go back to how it was. And the other person is saying, well, I don't know if I can trust you, but yeah, let's go back to how it was. You can't go back to how it was, because the people I'm working with aren't crazy or stupid. It's like you'd have to be kind of crazy or willfully stupid to go back to how it was, because you can't unknow what happened. You have to actually figure out how it's meaningful. And the couples that can do that are showing faith, because they're accepting, yeah, this was wrong, you shouldn't have done that, but there's some meaning here we better look at, because I know you're not inherently an evil person and yet you did a bad thing. Well, if you're not and see, that's a statement of faith also, by the way. And I almost always say this to couples in the first session. Well, 20 minutes in, I will tend to say, well, I can already tell about both of you that either one of you is crazy. And they will smile, and I don't mean to make fun of serious mental health issues, of course. Every once in a great while, I've met a couple where I wouldn't say that because somebody is, having a manic episode or is showing psychosis or something, But the vast majority of people I'm working with, they're not crazy. They're certainly not stupid. They're not inherently evil, even when they've done bad things. They're doing the best they can, like we all are. And that's a statement of faith. And you start from that assumption. Then when you look at somebody who did something they shouldn't have done, you say, well, okay, let's figure out what was the context of that? How'd you get there? And if you can learn from that, then there's the possibility, if both people feel like they've learned from it, that's what builds trust. They can say, oh, okay, now I know how we got here. So I have reason to think that if some of those conditions started again, we would know it much sooner. We'd act on it way before anybody cheats. So that's all of that is based on faith.
Wow. Your book is not about communication, challenges a widely held belief in couples therapy. What's the main myth you are busting there?
The main myth I'm busting is that if you teach people communication techniques, that will make them function better. And that's my main thesis is, the communication techniques you can learn, and lots of people will teach them. There are shelves full of books about them, and they're not bad ideas. None of these are bad ideas. Active listening, you probably heard of perhaps, or making I statements rather than you statements, all good ideas. There's nothing wrong with them. The myth I'm busting is that if you teach people those ideas, they will then function better. And the reason that's a myth is, if you look at a couple that is doing well, a couple that is happy with each other and not the people who come to make appointments with me, for some reason, everybody makes an appointment with me is having problems. Go figure, So, but if you're looking at a couple that's doing well, they are more or less following those rules. They're not yelling at each other, they're not calling each other names, they're not, they're mostly trying to understand what each other is saying. They're not doing it formally, but informally, that's what they're doing. They're following those rules. But if you teach a couple that is not doing well how to communicate better, you'll find it usually won't get them anywhere, because again, rare exceptions, the vast majority of folks I work with are perfectly competent communicators. The problem isn't that they need to learn how to communicate. The problem is what they are so effectively communicating. What they're communicating is distrust, contempt, anger, disrespect. They're communicating those things very effectively. They don't need better communications tools. They need to not be feeling contempt, distrust, anger, disrespect. And that's a very different process from teaching a bunch of rules to communicate. And I've seen this happen with folks who have spent enormous amounts of time learning systems of communication and learning how to, take turns talking and all that stuff. They're still very effective at communicating how much they distrust each other using all of those techniques. It doesn't get them anywhere. It's just a fallacy to think just because a well-functioning couple does this teaching. You know what my favorite, it's a silly analogy, but my favorite analogy, you ever watch professional tennis players, like I'll watch them on TV and they're grunting loudly when they hit the ball, every time they hit the ball. So I guess if I want to be like a professional tennis player, like Rafael Nadal or something, all I have to do is start grunting and it'll be a much better tennis player, right? No, they're not grunting. They're not good tennis players because they're grunting. They're grunting, probably associated with being a good tennis player, but the way to get there is not to learn how to grunt. The way to get there is learn how to play better tennis. So it's the same thing with a couple. Teaching people to behave, to look like they're behaving the way well-functioning couples behave will not make them well-functioning. So that's the main myth I'm busting. I want to mention the subtitle of that book as well. The subtitle of that book is very snarky. It's Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong. And I mention in the book that applies to me too. Everything I know about couples therapy is wrong also. Now, what am I trying to say with that? It's like I wrote a book. Come on, I think I have some good ideas. I think I do have some good ideas. I think lots of people have some good ideas, many of which are in opposition to mine, and they're good ideas too. If I think I know, if I think I have the last word, that's when I'm doing damage rather than helping people. So the idea that, oh, there's one way to do this and that's the only way it's going to help, that idea itself is damaging. And so that's what I mean by why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong. If I claim to know, oh, this is the last word on the subject, that is not going to help people.
Wow. Wow. I want us to talk about the communication, like if you can emphasize more on the couples communication, because it looks like that is the main focus in a relationship. Like that is what holds it together when you get it right, is
Mhm.
what will actually keep a lot of the mess out. So we are talking about respect. And ultimately, for me, I always say that let's use the golden rule wherever we find ourselves, and even in our relationships. What you don't want to be done to you, don't do it to the other person.
Yes,
Basically, yeah.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, and that's a good guideline to start with. And indeed, but of course, you're talking there about genuine respect.
Yeah.
You're not talking about communication techniques. So indeed, the way you can look at a couple and see, gee, how are you guys doing, is a lot about how they communicate with each other. But the solution there is, that what you just described is something that's in your heart. You said, okay, I want to treat this person. I don't want to hurt this person in ways I don't like being hurt. There's some people have also mentioned the platinum rule. Have you ever heard that one? So the golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The platinum rule is no, do unto others as they would have you do unto them. Because the way I want to be treated maybe isn't the same as my wife wants to be treated, and that applies in lots of different domains. And so I should be attending to, well, never mind what I like, never mind what I would like her to do for me. Let me think about what she wants me to do for her, and I'll do that. But all of that is, again, I do that and she does that based on the fact that we feel good toward each other. It makes us feel good to do that. And so it becomes self-reinforcing. And if a couple doesn't feel that way, it's really hard to fake that.
Yeah. Wow. After working with couples for over 30 years, what would you say is the most misunderstood aspect of healing from betrayal?
Wow, great question. I don't know. The most misunderstood aspect of healing from betrayal. I suppose it has something to do with that concept of if you can just go back to the way it was,
Yeah.
then things will be okay. Like that was just a bump in the road, and I'll never do that again. And and I hate to speak in absolutes, but that never works. It just, you can't go back to how it was. That sounds like, oh no, it's a disaster. We're stuck with this pain. No, not necessarily. Nobody wants to be in a relationship where one person is the permanent villain and the other is the permanent probation officer. They don't want to be like that. But it is possible to get past it. But you don't get past it by forgetting it or by going back to how it was. You get past it by growing. And
Yeah.
when things go well, they look back on it as a painful but necessary period of growth. So I guess that would be a fallacy. People come in with saying it was good before. Why can't we go back to that? And that's a fallacy. They can't.
Mm. You co-host a podcast with your wife, Judy. What have you both learned about working and communicating as a couple whilst helping others navigate their relationship?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, my wife Judy Alexander and I have been doing this, and a lot of folks tell us when they look at our podcast. Yeah, because we're not usually we're not talking about ourselves particularly, but what they see is a couple that really loves each other and enjoy. Yeah, they see the chemistry, and that's a lot of what we're putting forth. Is just we just enjoy it. We do it because we love doing it. She's not a therapist; she's a retired educator, and she was the principal of a religious school at our synagogue for many years and taught in public school before that, and I'm the therapist of the two of us. I would like to say I'm the therapist and she's the real person. And we just have a whole lot of fun doing it. And I think that's what we're presenting. It's like the and if we weren't already having fun, I don't think it would be fun for us to do a podcast. I know plenty of couples that would have a hard time trying to do something like that. But we seem to both enjoy it, and we have very different roles in it, and that seems to work well too. We're not contending over what the roles are. As I say, I'm the therapist, so you know I'm the one acknowledged as therapist, and she's the one acknowledged as regular person. So she'll often ask questions of me, or if we're interviewing another therapist, she'll be asking questions like the sort of questions people who aren't therapists might well ask,
Yeah.
rather than letting just the two of us kind of nerd out, which I'm prone to. I'm a recovering nerd with frequent relapses. So I often relapse into my nerd self, and she's
Oh,
very good at showing up at the right moment there.
wow. What will your final message be to our listeners as we wrap up?
I will fall back on the 7 words. That's my favorite summary: be kind, don't panic, and have faith.
Wow, be kind, don't panic, have faith. Thank you very much, Dr. Bruce, for coming on Podcast with Sheila today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been fun.
If you've been listening in, this is season 2, episode 134 of our podcast series, where we bring seasoned guests with inspiring real life experiences and stories to share with us. Do not miss out on all these lovely experiences. Subscribe and please be notified when a new episode is released. Whilst at it, please drop us a rating. Our prayer for you this week is that you become an advocate and a lover of peace. Until we meet again, have a brilliant week. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.